0-11 James Franklin is over top five opponents, and the eighth straight time that Ohio State has beaten Penn State. And quite frankly, the narrative is really starting to get old because it was definitely one of the best opportunities that they've had to defeat an Ohio State team for a very long time. And I was there last year when they played Michigan, and it was it kind of felt like same old in the sense because the offense could not get going at all whatsoever. Singleton and Allen were essentially shut down the entire game. Tyler Warren was not as heavily utilized as I anticipated, and moreover too, these wide receivers didn't get any separation on what I've said numerous times on the show, the most talented team in the entire country versus Ohio State. And Ohio State deserves a lot of credit though, even though this episode is going to be primarily focused on Penn State. But Jim Knowles, their defensive coordinator, did a phenomenal job with their game plan yesterday. They pretty much shut down Kalinicki's, creative sort of play calling. He got brought in from Kansas to come over to Penn State for these big moments, for these big games. And it was essentially just another same old kind of Penn State performance, especially when, Zion Tracy gets that pick six, they're up 10-0. And, there's a lot to be optimistic about in the moment because you're sitting there saying, wow, this, Will Howard's a little bit rattled at the beginning. He's, kind of taking this all in, especially his interview, before the game too. He talked about how this is a childhood, team that he grew up watching and grew up supporting. And, for Penn State to essentially pass on him, you can definitely tell he took this game personally. He threw 2 touchdowns yesterday. And, what Ohio State did was play fundamental football, and they deserve all the credit in the world for that. So when you compile all this together, I mean, obviously the takeaways from the Penn State game are definitely some questionable play calling, particularly in the red zone. Two really good opportunities at your own 3-yard line, and you come away with 0 points, which I think is ultimately was the deciding factor in this game. No offensive touchdowns, and you also have to say to yourself, when you have that many times in the red zone, you got to get to a point you just have to start executing, because those are the moments, those are going to be the differences where you win or lose a game. And moreover too, you were only in the Ohio State territory 4 times in the game. 4 times were you able to get to their side. And a lot of it too was pretty much a punt fest on offense too, because I was definitely a little bit surprised seeing how often Drew Allar ran in particular, because it was definitely just one of those games where they just couldn't get anything going. And Allar, for the most part, looked healthy too. So it's just, there's only so many more excuses that you can kind of come up with for this Penn State team. And I think one of the questions you have to ask yourself is, where does Penn State go from here in terms of, their rankings right now, and also, what is James Franklin's, long term at Penn State? What does that look like? Is there any possibility he can possibly take another job? But I think looking at the short term of Penn State, you're still in a good spot, because as long as you win out, you'll still be in the playoff. And the obvious criticism is, well, they haven't played anybody. They, this, that, or the other. But I mean, they did beat USC this year. They did beat Illinois. So it's not like they haven't played absolutely anybody. But in terms of, what we're talking about now, I mean, it's definitely gonna be one of those things that is going to get heavily scrutinized, especially when, you're comparing a 1-loss Power 4, a 1-loss Group of 5 versus perhaps even a 2-loss Power 4. And, moving to the rest of the year, it's looking very likely that they'll win these games. And, Minnesota did knock off Illinois too. So I would definitely be a little bit nervous about that game. But outside of that, it's definitely looking pretty strong that they'll go 11-1, get one of the open spots in there, and possibly play one of the conference champions, which I would be very intrigued to see, especially when you're at such an electric place like Beaver Stadium, which had a grand record of 111,035 in attendance. So that was awesome to see that energy there, and seeing Keegan Key out there, and all the guys being at game day, and having the Fox crew out there. Definitely you felt the energy, you felt the excitement, and I went to a Penn State bar and watched the game from there, and it was definitely worth watching and everything. But it's just one of those moments where you just kind of have to ask yourself, when is the narrative gonna change at all? And you know, if you look at Penn State right now, they're in a good spot. They should make the playoff and everything. But I think a couple things that you kind of have to work on here. I said it before, in my preview versus Ohio State. Obviously, I was clearly wrong about the game. It essentially, essentially what everybody kind of thought was going to happen happened, and a couple of things that are going to have to be addressed. I think number one, I mean, I just don't know. To me, there seemed to be a lot more opportunities to get Tyler Warren the ball. I mean, their biggest play was a 33-yard run with him too. So you kind of have to ask yourself, how can they be more creative in terms of, getting Tyler Warren involved, and most importantly too, how do you make sure that Allen and Singleton aren't getting shut down? Because I don't really put this all on Drew Aller, really, because obviously the red zone interception that he threw was just a really great play by the Ohio State cornerback. You didn't get much help from your receivers. Ohio State secondary did an excellent job of not letting them get much separation, and they were playing physical. They weren't just gonna, they kind of bullied those receivers around a little bit, and it showed on the football field too. And I was criticizing Ohio State's offensive line, over the weekend. You got to give them a ton of credit. I mean, they did just enough to get Henderson and Junkins going, enough to the point where Penn State had to start respecting that. Will Howard threw two touchdown passes. He did, just enough to lead them to a victory. And, they definitely deserve a lot of credit for that. But at the same time, the narrative is going to keep coming back to, when is James Franklin ever going to win the big game? Because when you go 0 for 11 against top 5 opponents, which is the worst record since 2000, since they've tracked that statistic, and it just gets to a point where something has to give too. But if we're talking about this more in a long-term way, okay, let's say Penn State, they went out, they go 11-1, and let's just say they lose in the first round of the playoff. Let's just say that's the hypothetical that we're going with. The problem you have if you're a Penn State fan and want to get rid of James Franklin, because there were some fire James Franklin chants at the end of the game, which, of course, I'm not on that train. I think all of that is kind of silly, but you're at the point where James Franklin is a player's coach. He is heavily respected. He is a phenomenal recruiter. And quite frankly, he's just a great personality too. I mean, if you watch his interview that he did with Pat McAfee for the game, he has some spark, he has some charisma, and there's a reason why players want to play for him. And I think that's something that you kind of have to step back a little bit and definitely take that into consideration too. But even at the time, it was just a very, volatile situation that he kind of got put into. So, definitely give Bill O'Brien credit too, even his predecessor who, got put in a really difficult spot being there. And the thing you have to ask yourself is, okay, let's say, James Franklin, maybe he were to entertain some different jobs. He's turned down multiple jobs, but it does kind of make you wonder, for example, would the University of Florida, pursue James Franklin if, Lane Kiffin were not to work out? And would he have any interest in doing that? Because at this point, if you're Penn State, you have to ask yourself, okay, well, Michigan took a step back this year, so you're not worrying about them as much. But now you have to worry about Oregon, who is one of the best teams in the country and, hasn't shown too many weaknesses. You lost to Ohio State again, and they completely shut down your offense that, Andy Kolenicki was, getting all the credit and all the hype in the world for. And I was certainly buying into it, especially, watching the games versus USC and Illinois and, some of the bigger games that they've played this year. He is the real deal. And I give James Franklin props for, making that bold of a hire too. He came from Kansas under Lance Leopold too, but you're just at the point now where something just has to give. But at the moment, I think in essence, I would argue you're stuck with James Franklin for good and bad. Because yes, when you have James Franklin as your head coach, you're always gonna have a pretty strong recruiting class, at least in the top, top 25 bare minimum. I don't have the stat on what the recruiting class is right now, but you're definitely within the top 25 every recruiting class. You get some of the best kids from the entire state who want to come to your program. You get the benefit of your program being exposed now on the West Coast, which is a huge benefit, especially when for example, they played UCLA this year as well. So that's definitely another big positive that you have in terms of the long term element of having James Franklin at Penn State. But if you're Penn State too, like the other thing I think about too is if they were to, if James Franklin were to move on, who would they go out to get? Because I mean, I think in many ways James Franklin seems content with what he's done, and I think he understands the criticisms, and everybody has kind of said the same thing. But moving forward right now, you kind of just have to say to yourself, if you're a Penn State guy, I would say right now you're stuck with James Franklin for good, bad, or indifferent. You're going to have to make some offensive adjustments, and particularly getting Tyler Warren more, and getting back to your bread and butter, what that has worked all year, which is primarily being a rush first team, and then having Drew Aller being put in a position where he can be poised, he can be confident, and make enough plays where he's not turning the ball over, and ultimately is another weapon that they can use to get points on the board. But Ohio State did a lot yesterday where they deserved the win. They played well, and Ohio State and Penn State, they both played really good defense yesterday too. So although yes, the story is James Franklin is about them losing the game, but at the same time, there are a lot of positives. If you are a Penn State fan, you play really strong defense. It's definitely a bit of a concern about some of those big drives that Ohio State were able to get throughout the game. They had a 74-yard drive, an 84-yard drive, so there were definitely some sustainable drives that they had. But I think a big question mark is let's just at this point if you're a Penn State, you want to get through the rest of these games, come back healthy, come back stronger, continue to make adjustments. And, hopefully even just getting a first playoff win, I think would definitely put a lot less pressure on James Franklin. But I think in the moment right now, you are in essence stuck with James Franklin for good, bad, or indifferent. I think he is a great coach, but maybe you get to a point where maybe it's best for him to have a change of scenery and go somewhere else. But I think for the time being, he is where he should be. He is where he needs to be. And I definitely think this Penn State team is still a pretty strong team, but you just kind of have to ask yourself, how many more of these moments is Penn State's donors going to be able to put up with?